Welcome back. Today, this explainer is jumping right into the complex and, let's be honest, often totally contentious tug-of-war between free trade and protectionism. You know, we hear about tariffs, trade wars, and global supply chains on the news literally all the time, but how do these mechanics actually work under the hood? Let's get into it. To start things off, just ask yourself, where was your car actually made? You might instantly think of a single country, but the reality? It's a whole lot more complex. A typical modern vehicle is basically a global jigsaw puzzle. It's designed in Japan, uses electrical parts from Germany, steering systems from the US, seatbelts from Sweden, and climate systems from Belgium, all before finally being assembled in Mexico. This perfectly grounds the whole abstract concept of globalization right into our everyday reality. It's not just some dry economic theory. It's literally parked in your driveway.
All right, so here's our roadmap for today. We're going to cover global interdependence, the gains of exchange, the cost of protectionism, subsidies and export restraints, and finally wrap up with regional trading blocs.
Kicking things off with Section 1, Global Interdependence and how it connects the world.
To see the macro view of that car example we just talked about, we just need to look at the data. And wow, look at this. Global trade has nearly doubled as a percentage of GDP since 1970. What you're seeing here is a fundamental, massive shift in how the world actually does business. It's this growing interdependence that gives companies the opportunity to seek out the absolute best inputs for their products, optimizing for both top-tier quality and cost-effectiveness across borders.
Moving right along to Section 2, gains from exchange, and exactly why countries bothered to trade in the first place.
So the foundational logic here is actually pretty simple. Gains from trade happen when countries can get a higher price for what they sell or pay a lower price for what they buy compared to trying to do everything purely domestically. Trade allows for a much more efficient allocation of resources. Because each country specializes based on its comparative advantage, production goes up, costs come down, and ultimately the overall global pie just gets bigger.
Let's look at a really cool real-world example straight from our sources. Think of Logitech, the Swiss computer peripherals company. Back in the late 1980s, to win these massive OEM contracts from IBM and Apple, they knew they needed to innovate and scale up quickly and cheaply. So what do? They moved production to Taiwan. Why? Well, to access a highly qualified labor force, extremely competent local suppliers, and some super competitive science park space. It is a textbook demonstration of how a company leverages international trade and economies of scale to win on a global level.
Which brings us to Section 3, the cost of protectionism, and what happens when governments step in to restrict that free exchange.
Now, we need to establish what a tariff actually is before we look at its overall impact. At its core, a tariff is simply a tax levied on imported goods. And while governments primarily use them to protect local jobs in domestic industries from foreign competition, we really have to recognize that they act as a direct, inescapable tax on the domestic consumer. It's your wallet taking the hit.
Let's break down the actual math behind this because it's fascinating. Think of consumer and producer surplus as giant buckets of money in an economy. Before a tariff, consumers have a massive bucket. But when a tariff gets introduced, it shifts all that money around. Because prices go up, the consumer surplus drops. That's the area labeled A, B, C, and D on the chart here. Now, Area A, that shifts directly into the local producer's bucket. Area C goes straight into the government's bucket as tax revenue. But look closely at areas B and D. That money doesn't go to anyone. It just spills right onto the floor. In economics, we call that deadweight loss. It's pure inefficiency caused by keeping less efficient producers in the market and blocking what would have been mutually beneficial trades. Now let's compare tariffs with another really common trade restriction, quotas. While the tariff is a tax, a quota is a hard physical limit on the actual quantity of goods that can come in. The key difference here? You always have to follow the money. With a tariff, the importing country's government collects that tax revenue. But with a quota, foreign producers can often just raise their prices because of the artificially limited supply. So they capture that excess profit, which economists call quota rents. Meaning, a quota can actually be far worse for the importing country's overall national welfare than an equivalent tariff. Pretty wild, right?
All right, Section 4, Subsidies and Export Restraints, or as I like to call it, tilting the scales. Enter the export subsidy. This is a direct payment from a government to a local firm for every single unit they sell abroad. Now, sure, while it sounds incredibly helpful for local businesses looking to expand globally, an export subsidy actually reduces overall national welfare. Why? Well, because it artificially interferes with the free market.
It ends up encouraging local production that completely ignores a country's true comparative advantage. And when we synthesize all these policies into one view, a really startling trend emerges. Look at this. Whether a government uses tariffs, import quotas, export subsidies, or voluntary export restraints, the domestic result is universally the exact same. Domestic prices increase and domestic consumption decreases every single time. The government is essentially forcing domestic consumers to foot the bill in order to protect domestic producers.
Finally, let's jump into Section 5, Regional Trading Blocs, the exclusive clubs of global commerce.
So you might be wondering, if free trade is so demonstrably great for creating economies of scale, why don't we just have one big global agreement and be done with it? Well, because getting the entire world to agree through the World Trade Organization is incredibly complex and painstakingly slow. Trying to align the specific, often competing interests of nearly 200 different countries, yeah, it's tough. So instead, countries form smaller, regional clubs. It's just much quicker, politically a whole lot easier, and it allows neighbors to rapidly speed up their economic cooperation.
Let's see how this creates a sort of staircase of economic integration. It starts pretty simply. It's step 1, with a free trade area, like the USMCA between the US, Mexico, and Canada. This simply removes barriers between the members. Then step 2, a customs union, takes it further by creating a united common tariff wall against the rest of the world. Step 3, a common market, actually lets labor and capital move freely across borders. And finally, step 4, an economic union, adds shared economic institutions and often even a shared currency. Think of the European Union.
But these trading blocks aren't perfect economic solutions. They actually result in two distinct effects. The good part is trade creation. This is when you replace expensive domestic production with cheaper imports from inside your brand new club. But there's a bad part, and that's trade diversion. This happens when your new club forces you to stop buying from the absolute cheapest global producer just because they happen to be outside the club, and instead you have to buy a more expensive version from a club member. So if the diversion outweighs the creation, a trading bloc can literally reduce overall economic efficiency.
Which brings us to our final takeaway for this explainer. As these massive regional blocks grow deeper and stronger, we really have to ask ourselves, are we actually moving toward true, efficient global free trade? Or are we just building larger, heavily armed economic fortresses that just compete against each other? The answer to that question is going to define the entire future of globalization and directly impact global markets, supply chains, and crucially, your investment portfolios. Definitely keep that in mind as you watch international trade policies unfold. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and keep learning.